Well, I hope this finds you well. Welcome to Midweek Bible Study. We're so glad you're here. Want to encourage you again, just to remind you that we still meet in person and would love to have you join us there if possible. It gives an opportunity for us to be able to break this down just a little bit more and have a conversation about it, whereas the video doesn't allow us to do that. Although you're welcome to ask questions or to call the church, anything, let us know if there's anything I can respond to or Peggy can respond to. Or Chris, either way, we would love to be able to walk alongside you and help you grow spiritually. We get to continue with that midweek Bible study this week for the book of Isaiah. And we have made our way through chapter 13 last week. And so this week we are opening chapter 14, quite a bit longer, but nonetheless, we'll get started with it. You're going to see in chapter 14 where it's more of a poem or a song. It looks like a song that could be called like a taunt song where God would taunt these people, or the Israelites would taunt the people. You can kind of read it that way if you like. This chapter begins and ends with a statement, and the song is kind of in the middle. It will show God rising up against Babylon. The created cannot exalt itself over the Creator. You'll get that picture as well. And believe it or not, there is a vision of hope that's seen in this. Even with what looks like a lot of destruction. If we begin, we'll start with chapter 1 here. Chapter 14, verse 1. It says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will still choose Israel and settle them in their own land. The strangers will be joined with them, and they will cling to the house of Jacob. Then people will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them for servants and maids in the land of the Lord. They will take them captive, whose captives they were, and rule their oppressors." And we get to see that God's compassion for his people would ultimately deliver them from the hands of the Babylonians. The mercy that God would have for the Israelites goes back to the promise that he made to them through Abraham. The second verse indicates the complete turn around from being captive to captor. And I don't see this as much literal as I see it in God's sovereignty over all, even the worldly powers. And I think we forget about that sometimes, because things that have power over us sometimes, and those are worldly powers sometimes, we forget that God can take all of that and has the power to take over all of that. Verse 3, "It shall come to pass in the day the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and hard bondage in which you were made to serve, that you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say." And before we finish that and begin the song, the day of the Lord would provide relief from the oppression that they were feeling. One commentator mentioned the idea that even in our Christian foundation, we should not get upset when people who set out to deny God and destroy his people are overthrown. That doesn't mean that we ask for calamity on people, but the fact of the matter is, we shouldn't be all sympathetic for people that do deny God and ultimately pay the punishment or the price for that. It's their choice. They made a choice. Now we get to focus on the taunt song, or the poem. It's a Hebrew poem. It's broken down into 4 stanzas. The first, which is verses 4b, so that's the second part of verse 4, through verse 8. I got chapters and verses here mixed up. But nonetheless, it's verses 4b through 8, and it shows the relief from the release with the tyrant gone. And so there would be relief once their oppressors were gone. The second one is verses 9 through 11, and it shows the expression of those in Sheol. So you kind of work your way from earth to the lower regions, who would find out that even this man is mortal. So that's a picture of that. The third stanza is verses 12 through 15, and it shows the move from Sheol to heaven, and it shows the effects on man. And then the fourth stanza is verses 16 through 21, and it shows the picture of a return to earth and the disgrace that comes through pride. So God will always drive out our pride and man's pride, and you'll see that picture here as well, mainly the pride of the nation of Babylon or the other nations that are opposing God, but God would ultimately take that out and ultimately squish their pride. So let's get started with this song, or the Hebrew poem. It says, "How the oppressor has ceased. The golden city ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, he who struck the people in wrath with a continual stroke. He who ruled the nations in anger is persecuted and no one hinders. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. Indeed, the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were cut down, no woodsman has come up against us." And one thing you need to understand with this section is that the emperors in the northeast were very proud. They would insist on everything following their way at all costs. Now, the effects of the fall on one of these emperors in the surrounding region or in his area of reign would bring about a cause of joy in the people because the oppression would be broken. Remember that much of the rule by those who reigned was done by terrorizing these people and literally, like I said, oppressing them. In verse 8, the writer gives us imagery to kind of reinforce what he said in the preceding part of the poem. It says, remember that God's actions cut at the pride of people when they were taken down. In this case, the emperors actually thought they had dominion over nature and the trees. And so that's the picture that you get with the cypress and the cedars. So they had control over everything, they thought, but God wins out in the end. The second stanza gets with verse 9, or starts with verse 9. It says, hell from beneath is excited about you. To meet you at your coming, it stirs up the dead for you. All the chief ones of the earth, it is raised up from their thrones, all the kings of the nations. They all shall speak and say to you, have you also become as weak as we? Have you become like us? Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, and the sound of your stringed instruments, the maggot is spread under you, and the worms cover you. Now, this section takes us from earth kind of to the underworld, or really to the underworld, and the results of what God did here were met with celebration on earth, but not so much in the underworld. The celebration in the earth happened because the oppression and stuff was done, but there's a welcoming, if you will, in the underworld for these people who ultimately lost the battle. And you see some more imagery in verse 11, and it takes us from seeing a prominent funeral. So if you can imagine having a prominent funeral of a king, just like we saw with the Queen of England, you saw this pomp and circumstance. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's just that there's a celebration for this person. And you can see the pomp and circumstance that would happen with the king that would die. And you would think there would be this great big funeral and very upscale and very, everything's in its place and all that stuff is done. But then it's abruptly met with a corpse with no pomp and it's now covered with maggots and worms. And so literally you go from what's supposed to be majestic to something that is completely lacking any kind of majesty. And so there's a very big picture of what that looks like, or the difference in what that looks like. So we get started with the third stanza. It says, now, or how you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the furthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High, yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. So you can see a swelling of pride in someone, but ultimately humility would happen, and they would be taken from their lofty perch in their eyes, and it would be seen as low. And this kind of stanza takes us from the underworld up to heaven. And it illustrates the damage that can be done by human pride. And if you look closely at it, you'd see a similar picture to what Adam and Eve offered. Remember, the serpent told them that if they ate the fruit, they could be like God and know the difference between good and evil and all of that. Instead, though, it would highlight the proof of their frailty and their finality as it related to their death. It didn't do what they hoped that it would do. Verses 16 through 21, and that's the last stanza here. It says, "Those who see you will gaze at you and consider you, saying, 'Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world as a wilderness and destroyed its cities? Who did not open the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, all of them sleep in glory, everyone in his own house. But you are cast out of your grave, like an abominable branch, like the garment of those who are slain, thrust through with the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a corpse trodden underfoot. You will be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land and slain your people. The brood of evildoers shall never be named. Prepare slaughter for his children because of the iniquity of their fathers, lest they rise up and possess the land and will fill the face of the world with cities.'" Now, this final scene brings us back to earth, and you'll see the disgrace for the corpse. And so no longer is it a king or whatever, it's just now known as a corpse. And it shows this corpse, really primarily the soul, would wander the earth disillusioned. So remember, when they were a king, they had pride and all of that stuff, but now they would be made lowly and they wouldn't even have a decent burial. In fact, their soul would be doomed to wander the earth. Now, people would look down on this and in wonder, as the king would not be looked down upon. In verse 20, we see the judgment of the king to include not for what he did to someone else's land or people, but for what he did to his own land and his own people. And it would be an utter disgrace. I mean, there should be some sort of pride, some sort of whatever for your people. And unfortunately, he would do so much destruction that they would look down upon him and not up to him. Then we get into this one of the last little closing part of the song or the poem. It says, "For I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant, and offspring and posterity, says the Lord. I will also make it a possession for the porcupine and marshes of muddy water. I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, says the Lord of hosts." Now, these two verses are the closing statement to the end of the taunt. However, it would not be focused on a specific individual. It would be focused on the entire nation, and they would be brought low. There would be a humility that happened, and it would be something that's forced, not something that they did on their own. But because of their pride and everything like that, they would be basically cut off from the knees or down by their knees. Then we get into verse 24. It says, "The Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so it shall come to pass, and as I have proposed, it shall stand, or so it shall stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains tread him underfoot. Then his yoke shall be removed from them, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the purpose that has purposed against the whole earth, and it is the hand that is stretched out over the nations, for the Lord of hosts has purposed. And who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back?" Now, in some translations, because you can get Assyrian in here and get caught up in that, but in some translations, you'll see the reference to Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia would most likely stand for the whole earth. So from God's land out, or the people of promised land out, and it would kind of represent the entirety of the earth. Now, this earth was standing against God, but God would ultimately win, and it would ultimately humble the people. They would be trampled underfoot. And you can see that, the fact that God would win in these last two verses. Then we go on, it says, Philistia destroyed. And it says, this is the burden which came in the year that King Ahaz died. Do not rejoice, all you of Philistia, because the rod that struck you is broken. For out of the serpent's roots will come forth a viper, and its offspring will be a fiery flying serpent. The firstborn of the poor will feed, and the needy will lie down in safety. I will kill your roots with famine, and it will slay your remnant. Wail, O gate, cry, O city, all you of Philistia who are dissolved, for smoke will come from the north, and no one will be alone in his appointed times, that they will answer the messengers of the nation, that the Lord has founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall take refuge in it. Now, one of the issues that started all of this was Judah's inability to focus on God for help. In fact, they focused on other people. This part of the text also focuses on a judgment on the surrounding nations that Judah would potentially reach out to for additional help. Doesn't mean they will, it's just that they could have asked out for help, and so God was kind of removing all of the excuses, if you will. You got to remember, as it relates to this, there's 5 other major cities out there with kings in them, and so all of those are potential places where Ahaz could have cried out for help, but God would take that away. This oracle is also one of the few that are dated. And it comes in verse 28 where it talks about the death of King Ahaz. Now, there's a lot of disagreement over the time that happened, and the dates range anywhere from 727 BC to 715 BC. And that may not seem like that much time, but the fact of the matter is there is a tremendous amount of things, or there are a tremendous number of things that happened in between those time frames. But one of the reasons, I think, and the primary reason for kind of trying to narrow that death down is they're trying to line it up with, or theologians are trying to line it up with the revolt of the Philistines toward the Assyrians. And know that when a king dies, it opens up a hole, or it leaves a vulnerability, if you will, because of the lack of leadership in a particular kingdom. And so when there's a lull or an opportunity, and I don't know where you fall politically, but you can tell the difference in years past where we've had very strong presidents and then we've had very weak presidents, even in our country. And when we have weak presidents, there seems to be a lot of calamity around the world. When we have stronger presidents, there's less of it. And so I believe, just like Reagan said, you can lead through a position of strength, and it will cause a calmness, if you will, even in the aggressors that are around you. But when you're weak, you tend to have aggressors that stand up and decide, hey, this is mine. And so that's kind of the picture that's going on here. Ahaz's death also, you have to understand, would have been met with a lot of joy by both the nation, his nation, and also the surrounding nations, because of his cruelness and his ability to be a little overwhelming. And verse 30 and 31 give us imagery as well of a siege. And you can imagine what a siege looks like. It's a gradual taking away. It's not something that happens all at one time. It's a little at a time. And so God's timing would be perfect here, and it would slowly eat them away, if you will. Hope you enjoyed this. I did. I'm enjoying walking through Isaiah. Certainly done it before, but every time I read it, I get something new out of it. I know we tend to do some of the similar things to what the nation of Judah or Israel was doing, which is to run for help. And unfortunately, God, not unfortunately, but fortunately, God's always there. But the unfortunate part for us is we tend to reach out for help from everywhere else before we finally settle on Him. And I think this is a picture for us to grab a hold of and to remember that God is always there, and God desires our attention. But He also, when we're in trouble, that should be the first place we go, because nobody else has the power to fix it. I pray God will bless you. I pray you have a great rest of the week. And I pray that God will continue to spiritually enable you and guide you. And I pray, Lord, I pray that all of what we say and do brings Him honor and glory. And we will talk to you on Sunday or next week. Give me a call if you need anything.